Welcome to the Victorious Souls podcast with me, your host, Danielle Burnock, that lady on the internet who loves you, connecting you to the love that heals so you can love yourself from survive to thrive. Today, I have with me Mark McNear. And Mark, he is a licensed clinical social worker in New Jersey with over 30 years experience. He focuses on helping others who have trauma, abuse, and addictions. But I want to pause here, listener. I want you to take note of this. He not just helps people with his extensive schooling. Mark is a trauma, abuse, and addiction survivor himself. He knows it from both sides. And he's the author of his new book, Finding My Words. So welcome to the show today, Mark. Thank you so much for sharing your story with my audience.
Thank you, Danielle. It's a pleasure to be here.
Like I was telling you before we started, I'm going to start a little differently than I normally do. You
Let's
are
do
a
it.
clinical social worker. What led you to go into that line of work?
It's a long time ago. It was about 35, 36 years ago that I was in Bible college and I was studying to be a pastor. And then because of some of the things in my past, I went into counseling. I went into counseling individually, and I also went into counseling with my wife for premarital counseling. And that was really, really helpful for me. And I realized how significant that
Mm,
experience was for me. And
mm,
so I really felt like there was a change in career path for me. And I
mm.
decided to I started kind of asking people questions and taking more courses in psychology. And then before I knew it, I found that my career path had changed, and I took more classes at the end of my time in Bible college in psychology, and took an extra year actually in Bible college, and then went on to New York University where I got my master's in social work.
Wow. Yeah, I saw you have an extensive education. So I wanted people to know that you are very smart and very schooled and know clinically what you're talking about, but you also know from the other side as well.
Yes,
How long did you practice before you found yourself in trouble and you got help? And how did that transition come about?
yeah, that's a great question, Danielle. I think that I was practicing for about 25 years.
Mm,
And when I started at NYU, my anxiety was really bad and my depression was really bad. And so I had a referral. Someone gave me a referral for somebody in the city, a psychiatrist, and I went to see him and he gave me medication. And the medication helped tremendously. It made me feel somewhat normal
mm,
from all of the anxiety and all of the depression. And little did I know at that time, which I found out was because of trauma.
mm,
And so you know, I started taking the medication, and in the beginning I was okay, but then I needed more and more medication to cope.
mm,
And so, with a lot of people with addiction, they increase the dosage.
mm.
And
What kind
so
of medication were you on?
I was on medication for depression. I was on antidepressant. I was also on medications for anxiety, and I was also on medications for ADHD.
Wow,
So a lot
that's a
of
lot of
lot of different
medication.
medications. Yeah.
Wow. So you were in counseling at the beginning when you were in school and with your wife and that. So you didn't go to counseling for trauma back then?
No, like trauma was never discussed. We talked a lot about depression. We talked a lot about anxiety. We talked a lot about just my inability to sit still, but it was never talked about. And the field is relatively new with trauma, so it really hadn't been talked about until the end of the '80s, beginning of the '90s, and then
Wow.
now really it's talked about a lot.
Yeah, so you were really addressing the symptoms rather than getting to the
Absolutely.
bottom, which was helpful, but not curative.
Right, right. Well, and in the long run, it was worse than worse than the prescription itself. But I didn't know that, and the doctors didn't know that. So I look back at it now. Hindsight's 2020 with any of these
Mm,
things. But I can definitely see why I went down the road that I went down.
mm. Well, where did you end up that, a change happened? You were practicing and then,
Well, I was practicing, and then it was in July of 2014. My dad
mm,
passed away.
oh, I'm so sorry.
Thank you. And so that seemed to open a door for healing for me, even in myself, to be willing to talk about some of the things that happened to me. And
Mhm.
so it was July 2014 that my dad passed away. And then fast forward to March 2015, I called my psychiatrist and I asked her for refills for medication. And, it became apparent very quickly that I was abusing the medication. And so she had talked to me and said, you really need to go to rehab. So
Mhm.
that wasn't something that I wanted, I wanted to hear. And so, I talk about that being one of the best days of my life and one of the worst days of my life.
I can imagine
Um,
that. Yeah.
yeah. And so at that point, Danielle, I really wasn't functioning well at all. I wasn't seeing clients. I wasn't well enough to, and I was sleeping, half the day, and the rest of the day just kind of like around the house watching TV and daydreaming and kind of zoning out. And so
Wow.
it was a real wake up call for me. And so talking with her, she recommended rehab right away. And so I waited for my wife to get home. Debbie came home from teaching. She's a teacher,
Mhm.
and so talked with her, and Debbie was just wonderful with it. She was like, I think this is wonderful that you're getting the help that you need. And
Mhm.
then I needed to contact my daughter. My daughter was in Florida at the time. And so contacted Emily and texted with her, and she was just wonderful as well, and saying, I'm so proud of you for making this decision. So within the next couple of days, I reached out to colleagues and got names and phone numbers of rehabs in the area. And I tell this in my story that, I had done this a lot for other people, for clients, but I'd never done it for myself. So it was hard. It was a really humbling
Oh,
experience for
I'm
me,
sure. Yeah.
and they'd be like, what does the person need? And I was like, I need. And then I would go on
Wow.
to explain to them what I needed. So I found a rehab a couple of hours from my home and checked into the rehab and was there for 3 months. And so
Wow. Can we
that,
back up just a little bit when
sure,
you
sure.
you talked with your wife and with your daughter and they were both proud of you. So it was evident to them that you had a problem, but it was not to you.
Right. So,
Would that be an accurate statement?
yeah, I think that's right
Why
on
do you think
target.
it was like that? And is that very common for men to hide behind or not know what's going on or hide it maybe even from themselves?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I definitely hid it from myself. I wasn't aware
Mm,
of it. I think Debbie became aware of it in time, and I think Emily knew that my behavior was not right. I think that, I think in the book I put something like, it was a real clear picture of, what addiction is like. Everyone knows except the addict. They're
mm,
not aware of it. I was clueless. I just knew I
wow.
needed to get more medication to get through the day.
Wow. So tell us about rehab. You checked yourself in and
Yeah,
then how did all that go? And tell us about like the nature of addiction, like you were starting to
yeah,
elaborate
I,
on.
I think that it was a culture shock for me because I had been used to being the therapist, and now I'm the
I just want
patient.
to pause here for a minute. Like listeners hear this, it would be a culture shock. I mean, I'm the one who's helping people. And now suddenly what, I need help?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I went to rehab. Debbie drove me. I was in no shape to drive, and so Debbie drove me, and we had a really good conversation on the way. The first part of the trip, I was really, really quiet and withdrawn. I kind of felt like uh, the reality of the situation hit. And so I felt like I had disappointed Debbie, and I felt like I had disappointed Emily. I felt like I had really disappointed family and friends. I felt like I disappointed my clients, and most of all, I felt like I disappointed God, and just felt like, in a lot of ways, like my life was over.
Yeah, there's just
So
so much shame that comes with
yeah,
trauma
like,
and abuse and addiction and that.
yeah, like, what's the matter with me? Like,
Mhm.
how did I end up here? And so I got there and they went through all my bags and looked for contraband. And so that was a fun experience. And then, got brought to a floor with about 30 other men, which I would be with them for a month. And then I transferred to another part of the rehab for another 2 months. It was a real culture shock for me.
Yeah.
And I talk about this, Danielle, in the book. One of the things that was really, really hard for me is as the medication was going out of my system because I wasn't taking it anymore, the memories of my childhood came back
Mm.
with a vengeance. And so that was really, really hard for me because, I had stuffed them down for
Did they
so
like come back that you were just remembering, or did you have flashbacks or both?
both,
Mm,
both, and some of the things were things from when I was like 4 years old that I had not thought about in like so many years. And so it was kind of like, how do I deal with this? And some of the things were things that I certainly wasn't ready to talk about emotionally, and I didn't have the words for.
mhm.
And so I just sat there kind of like, and I listened to what other people said. And that was really helpful, just hearing other people's stories.
Yeah, hearing their words.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
How
And
do you put
and
words to this? One of the side effects of childhood emotional neglect is the inability to find words and the inability to name emotion. Like you
yeah,
have a
and
feeling, what is it? I don't know. You have strengths and what are your strengths and weaknesses? What? I
exactly.
struggled with
And
that myself, and I thought, what's wrong with me? Why don't I know what my strengths and my weaknesses are? They do those in all the personality tests, but that is a side effect of childhood emotional neglect, which was one of the many things that you suffered as a child.
right. And I would find myself sitting there in rehab and feel so emotionally dysregulated. 1 minute that I would be super, super anxious, ready to jump out of my skin. And then an hour later feeling so numb and so withdrawn and so detached, and just being able to like just notice that my body was really part of the healing, but
Mhm.
it was really painful to go through, to
Oh,
notice
yeah.
just the emotional dysregulation. And still to this day, I still struggle with it, not to the extreme, but you know, um, just being there. And the other thing is the staff and other patients there were great, and they would encourage me to share my story. And there was no way that I was ready to do that. And so that was part of the challenge for me.
Mhm.
And I had a psychiatrist, and I talk about him in the book, Dr. Joe Garbely, and he just was absolutely wonderful. He was a man that had so much compassion, and he had shared with me in the first session. He had looked obviously at my case notes and some of the things that had happened to me that I did report, and he had said to me, "It looks like you've had substantial trauma." And he
Yeah.
said,
I've read the
as
book. Yeah.
yeah, as a, yeah, and he said, as a result of that, Mark, it's going to take you a long time. It's going to take you years to work through it.
Which
And
is probably both encouraging and discouraging at
you
the
know,
same time. I would like a magic pill and be right just fine, but then when it starts taking long, you're like, wow. That's one of the things I struggled with in my journey was beating myself up because I was taking so long. I didn't have anyone there because I didn't have any help. Just kind of
yeah,
waded through myself, but it does. The more significant, it's like the deeper the wound, the more time it takes to heal.
yeah, that's a perfect way. In a way, it was really encouraging. Yay, I have all this time. And then it was like, what are you talking about? It's going to take me years to get over this. And I found that it did take me quite a few years to begin, and I'm still processing it, but to be able to do some real substantial work to start to feel much more comfortable in my own body.
Mhm. And have that safe place and rehab those other people to once you could share
Yeah.
that, they understood to some extent. They were there in some their own story, variation on a theme of the same kind of inner upheaval.
Yeah, I had a friend there that I talk about him a little bit in the book, and he's a friend to this day. And it was just so wonderful, to be able to talk with him, and for him to be able to hear just a little bit of my story, and to be able to say, yeah, that's a strange story. But I remember him saying, make sure when you get out of here that you get help, find someone that you can talk to. And that did happen. God allowed that to happen. But, you know, just even one person
Mhm.
that is really safe in your life is so substantial, you
Yes.
know.
Yeah. So one of the things I'd like you to share with our listeners today, the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, because you had CPTSD, right?
Yeah,
A lot of
that's
people
that's
have never heard of the C. They just like,
yeah,
oh, what's the C in front of it? What difference does it make? It's a big difference.
yeah. So we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, disorder, and then we talk about complex post-traumatic stress disorder or complex trauma. Sometimes you hear it referred to as complex trauma. And the way that I'd like to explain it is not a real scientific way, and it's not a real clinical way, but I think it's a good picture of what happens. And that is, if you take over here, you take a plate and you put a pancake on it. That's more of a picture of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. You're talking about a person who's had a trauma, significant event in their life that's been very disruptive to them.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, over here, take a plate
Mm-hmm.
and put a stack of pancakes, which represents a stack of traumas that has happened in a person's life over a period of time. Both of them have different results. They're
Mm-hmm.
similar, but very different. And so whether you've had PTSD or whether you've had complex PTSD, both of them are significant and they need treatment. They need support, but it looks a little bit different. And one of the things that for complex trauma that they talk about is just mood dysregulation. It's difficult for people to regulate their moods. The shame is even greater because they've had more events that tell them that there's something wrong with them, because we tend to personalize the things that have happened to us and say, what's the matter with us, especially if we've had abuse as children.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So what are some other side effects of complex PTSD? You mentioned pervasive shame and the mood
The
dysregulation.
mood
What are some other
dysregulation,
things?
things like anxiety and depression. Sometimes people have symptoms that are synonymous with ADHD, having a hard time sitting still or a hard time focusing or a hard time concentrating. Difficulties with sleep is very common. Um, Difficulties, I already mentioned, with concentration. That's one. Chronic pain can be another. Um, Substance abuse or addictions, whether the addictions be process addictions, like things like pornography or shopping, or
Mm-hmm.
eating. Well, they wouldn't be. Let me go over that again. So substance addictions would be like eating or substances like drugs or like alcohol. Process addictions would be things like pornography, gambling, or shopping, things like that.
That's interesting. You mentioned process addictions. Can you elaborate on that? Why would someone develop a process addiction as opposed to a substance addiction? And can you
You
elaborate a
know,
little bit on
I
those differences?
yeah, I don't know if I could specify. Just different people reach out to different things and they find relief in them.
Mm,
Gabor talks about, don't ask why the addiction, but ask why the pain.
yeah.
So, it starts with pain, extreme pain that people have. And then out of that comes, find things that they find relief with.
Mm,
So sometimes people find relief in, gambling. It causes a lot of problems in the long run, but in the beginning, it brings relief to the person.
okay, so
Sometimes
would it be fair to say that the difference between a substance addiction and a process addiction would be a substance is something that you take in
and
to your body and a
yeah,
process is something that you do?
do exactly. Yeah, that's a
Okay,
great way to put it.
wonderful. I try to simplify, even like you did with the stack of pancakes. Thank you for simplifying because all those big fancy words sometimes can confuse us and we're not listening anymore because we're trying to, how did you pronounce that word?
Exactly.
But we can understand pancakes and we can understand taking something as opposed to doing something. So,
Doing something. Yeah, I think things also like just not feeling safe in your body or feeling a numbness,
mhm,
are symptoms of trauma.
mhm,
People will sometimes report a lot of problems with headaches,
mhm.
um, mentioned nightmares before, things like that, things that really disrupt one's life.
Yeah. So when you were released from rehab, how did you cope through that? You were in rehab for 3 months. 3 months is a really long time. Is there any particular story from rehab you want to share?
Well, I think that the one story that sticks out in my mind, which caused the book to come about is just the fact that, I was sitting in one meeting with a group of guys and a counselor, and the counselor asked me to tell some of my story, and I just couldn't.
Mhm.
I didn't have the words, and I didn't have the emotional wherewithal to do it.
Mhm.
And so it became clear to me in rehab. One of the things that I learned very clearly in rehab is I had a lot of work to do,
Mhm.
to be able to uh, talk about my story in a safe way in which I didn't get so dysregulated that I'd have to reach for things to comfort me that would be maladaptive. And so that's like out of 3 months, that's something that I walked away with, just how much woundedness I had, how much trauma I had.
Owning the
And
truth,
yeah,
validation.
yeah. And just realizing that, as I said, when I went to rehab, I felt like I had disappointed all of these people. And that was definitely true, these groups of people. But I also felt like I disappointed God. And that just was not true. And
Mhm.
and and one of the verses that I've taken out of my recovery and just really clung to is the verse in Romans 2:4. It is the kindness of God that leads to repentance, or it's the kindness of God that leads to change.
Mhm.
I was ready to become very militant and beat myself up and get regimented, and that wasn't. It was kindness that I needed,
Yeah.
and I needed that kindness from other people, and I
Yes.
needed that kindness, and I needed to see it from God. And I also needed then, which I'm still working on, you know, transferring it to myself,
Mhm.
becoming good at, you know, um, allowing myself not to beat myself up because that's something I grew up with.
Right, you were taught to beat yourself up, and that's it's hard to unlearn something that's been beaten into you.
Yeah.
So, you'd mentioned that your dad had died in 2014, you said? And that
Yes.
was before the whole rehab thing. I know he is the source of the majority, if not all of your trauma. Were you still in contact with him when he died? And did you
Yeah.
have relationship with him? Was it just superficial and pretending it never happened? Or,
Well,
I mean, how did his death affect you? Was it relief? And
yeah, that's that's hard. Now we're going to a hard area. I think that looking back at it now, um, I was one of his caretakers. My sister
mm,
did a majority of the caretaking, but I did some of the caretaking with him. So it was a matter of doing the right thing, even though I didn't feel like it.
mm.
Um, and so yeah,
What
there was
caretaker? What was wrong with him?
he was in his 90s,
Mm,
and so it was pretty much old age.
mm,
He had some different issues with sugar, and he had some things with Parkinson's,
mm,
and some other diagnoses, and so he really couldn't care for himself.
okay.
So we did a lot of the care for him. I can actually say too that there was such mixed feelings when he passed.
I can
You
imagine.
know,
They were
so
complex feelings, like the complex
yeah,
PTSD.
absolutely. There
I'm
there
so
was
glad I'm not glad. What's going on? You shouldn't be
yeah,
glad. Oh my goodness, I shouldn't feel like this.
absolute ambivalence. Such mixed feelings, that feelings of loss, but yet a feeling of freedom.
Hmm.
And like there was also, Danielle, this feeling of now what? Because I think my body was so geared up being around him.
Hmm.
And so I think that that was the beginning of healing though for me, because I didn't see it at the time because the addiction got worse and I
You still
medication
hadn't
and
addressed
even
the trauma at that time. The
yeah,
trauma was just
yeah,
shoved underneath at that time.
absolutely. So there were, like I mentioned to you, there were things that I had not thought of in 51 years that
Wow.
came out in rehab, flashbacks, memories of things that happened to me. Um, there
Well, your
was,
trash can story. If you want to tell your trash can
yeah,
story, you can
so
tell that one.
yeah, that was allowable, right? Some of
Yeah,
them
we
are
don't want
hard.
to get
Yeah,
graphic on here. We,
yeah, definitely.
listeners, we had a
Well,
conversation before. We don't want to get graphic because it could be. So
yeah,
we're going
so
to avoid
so
that just to save your ears.
so at 4 years of age, my dad had forced me to eat carrots, and I didn't want to eat the carrots, and I ended up with the carrots, and ended up vomiting as a result of it. And I began to cry, and he became irate, and he picked me up and he threw me into the garbage. And he said, "Stay there, you're a piece of garbage." And so,
I'm so sorry.
thank you. So, that was one of the memories. There was also a lot of other memories that I discuss in the book. There was, sexual abuse from the age of 4 to about the age of 7. And there was a lot of verbal abuse or covert verbal abuse. And there was emotional abuse. Now that I look back at it, there was a lot of emotional abuse that took place during that time. And so all of these memories, and some of them, honestly, I had not thought about since when it first happened. I had
Right.
compartmentalized and put them away, um, and said to myself, I would never talk about any of them. And so,
That's very common. I'm going to pause here for our listeners. That's extremely common for children to do that, is to hide it away because it's not safe to have it out there. And it's a natural coping mechanism that God has given us. But once we become adults, we need to bring that out so we can heal.
in time,
Mhm.
slowly, and
Yep.
so that has been my process over the last um, 8 years, to be able to go through things, and went through a lot of treatment. I got out. You asked me about rehab. What happened afterwards? I went into individual counseling with somebody who knew a lot about trauma, and I also did IOP, intensive outpatient
You did
therapy.
what?
IOP, which is
IOP?
intensive, yeah, which is going to therapy in a group, and it
Mhm.
would be 3 times a week for like 2 to 3 hours.
Mm.
And so I did that. And then I was going to a lot of meetings. I was going to a lot of NA meetings, Narcotics Anonymous meetings, and also went back to church and reestablished relationships there. And so I went for individual counseling for about, I think it was like a year and a half. And then I had to address a lot of the issues within my marriage, and a lot of the sexual brokenness that I had. And so I got in touch with a ministry, Pure Desire Ministries, and I worked with a gentleman, Harry Flanagan, and he was wonderful in holding my story well and
Mm.
going through. And I remember him saying to me, "I'm going to have you type up on a Word document, your trauma history." And I was like, "Oh
Oh, that's
gosh,"
painful. Oh my goodness.
But I so engaged with him and felt safe, and I was like, okay, I'm going to do this. And so I did that, and as I did that, even more memories came out, and he just held my story so well, and we were able to process a lot of the trauma that had happened to me. And
Did did recognizing and identifying and validating the multitude of trauma in your life, did it bring about a certain measure of aha to yourself of no wonder I was like that. No wonder I behaved like that. Did you get any of that through your
yes, yeah,
process of looking back
yeah,
and going, wow, yeah, now that makes sense.
yeah, and it's good that you said it, like, as a process.
Mhm,
Like, I would think about this and I'd be like, yeah, that makes sense with this, and then it was like, oh no, that happened, oh, that makes sense with this, and
mhm.
so things
It's like puzzle
became,
piecing back your life
yeah,
together.
yeah. And the goal for me and it was to stay somewhat emotionally regulated. And some days I did better than others, but that's okay because I was in a healing process. and
Mhm.
and so I took about 2 years off from work, um, and just worked on things intensely, and then I'm still to this day working on things a lot, doing a lot of different therapies. Um, just entered into doing internal family systems of um, therapy that's really helpful with trauma. But I've just really worked on, and for the first couple of years, I just worked on my relationship with Debbie,
Mhm.
and my relationship with my daughter Emily, and she has since gotten married, and so just worked on my relationship with her and Brandon, her,
Oh, that's
and
wonderful. See, there's healing in relationships. I'm going to pause for our your listeners again. There's healing in relationships too. It's not just you. If you need to heal, you can heal your relationships. If everyone will participate in that, you can bring healing to your relationships. Yes, I'm
Definitely.
thankful for that. I experienced that in my life. I know everyone does not, because you have to have willing participants on both
Yeah,
sides.
on both sides. Yeah. And I'm really, really thankful. Through the grace of God, Debbie has been wonderful in my process and understanding my background and where I came from and why some of the behaviors were so disturbing. And also with my daughter Emily and Brandon, they have been just wonderful. During the pandemic, they came to stay with us. And it was just a wonderful time to really connect and bond.
Wow.
And so really, really thankful for that as well.
Sounds like there was a lot of kindness there too.
Absolutely. Tons, tons.
Kindness. Oh, kindness is such a nice word. We need that. And one of the words I think in your subtitle of your book is the word gentleness.
Yeah.
We need
Yeah.
gentleness. We need gentleness. We need kindness. It's part of healing. When someone's healing, they need gentleness. They need kindness. It's a part of healing. So you're a believer. So when did faith enter into your story? And did you ever blame God for that or get mad at him? Or tell us about your
Yeah.
faith
So,
up and down or walk or around however messy it could be. I
yeah.
mean, because it can be a very messy thing when you throw
Yeah.
drama in there, which is almost everybody. It
Yeah,
can be
it's
messy.
messy. It's a messy story. At age 19, I was out on New Year's Eve and I got hit head on by a
Oh,
drunk driver. And so that landed me in the hospital for about a month. I broke my femur and had pulmonary embolism. And like I said, came close to death. And so I got out of the hospital after about 30 days and again felt lost. I've had a lot of those times when I just felt lost in my life, not knowing where to go. And so searching around and looking for things, I picked up a book by Norman Vincent Peale, The Power of Positive Thinking,
mm,
and read through that and really focused in on, a couple parts of it. Talked about getting a Bible, and underlining faith passages and going to church. And so I did those things. And one night at church, they gave an invitation, and I went forward and accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. And so that sent me on a path to go to Bible college. And so I wanted to go into the ministry and didn't know where I was going to go. And then it changed my third year where I ended up, not going so much into the pastoral track, but going into counseling. And so, yeah, things went well for first couple of years, but unaddressed trauma
yeah.
will get you every time, and that's what I've learned.
Mhm.
And so, was I mad at God? There were days when I was like, I don't understand why you've allowed this to happen.
Mhm.
And I felt frustration and I felt anger and I felt the pain. And there's times when that comes back now, and but Danielle, as I look at it now, I kind of see so much more the purpose that he had, in me being able to work with other people now and being able to Second Corinthians talks about, being able to provide others with, the healing or the gentleness or the kindness that he's provided. And now I get to do that. And it's absolutely wonderful. You
Yeah.
know, I can relate to other people, with the pain that I have been through with trauma and understand and not judge them
Mhm.
for their behaviors, but to look at it and realize that their behaviors had a purpose. A lot of times they don't work, but they had a purpose in them. And so I'm really blessed. I have a great life and have the opportunity. Started seeing people about 2 years after getting out of rehab, and then slowly started part time, and then went to full time. And now I get to see people that had a lot of issues with trauma and addiction and abuse, and wrote the book, which was an exciting thing, hard thing, but an
Mm.
exciting thing to do. And now, getting to speak and also write articles and do things like that. It's been wonderful. God
How
has
did you
been,
go from being a victim to being a victor, to not staying in victim? Because you had a lot that happened to you. It'd be very easy to stay a victim and go, this is not fair. Why this happened to me? But you're not doing that. You've become a victor.
I
How
think
could
if
someone, get from there? What would
I
you
think
tell
if I'm
someone?
honest, there have been days when I go back into that for a little while and then I'm pulled back out of it. I reflect on, how much God has done for me and how wonderful my life really is. But it's easy, to go back into that if you're
Mhm.
not careful. I think
Yeah,
things like gratitude, I think having good friends
yeah,
that remind me of why I'm on the journey that I'm on is really, really helpful. My wife,
yeah.
Debbie, is just awesome. I mean, Debbie has never, shamed me or said, like, I can't believe you did this or I can't believe you did that. She
No.
understands from the background that I came from. Same with my daughter, Emily, and her husband, Brandon. So I have so many things to be grateful for. But I'd say, I'd be quick to say that it's easy for me to fall back into it if I'm not careful. And
Yeah,
so I need to remind
because you're
myself.
human.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You're human,
And
and that's just human. Something that's I thought of recently. I'm not sure if people who are Bible scholars would be upset with this, but I think it's helpful because the Word of God is alive. It says it's alive, and we get revelation looking at it like you look at a diamond. It's got all different facets to it. Because the Bible said that Jesus bore our wounds and it was beaten and bruised and all that. People, talk about it was for our sin and all that. And it says that. I'm not saying it's not for that. But recently I started seeing it that it wasn't just for that. Because it talks in Hebrews about him being a faithful high priest and how he is touched with the feelings of our weaknesses, our infirmities. And sometimes it
yeah.
sounds just all too King Jamesy for me that I
Mhm.
I want it to sound like everyday life. So it's because I think he wants us to know how much he relates that Jesus bore all of that because he feels our pain.
Yeah.
He feels our pain. He feels our agony. He feels our anguish. He feels our frustration. He feels all those things. Like there's an organization out there called He Gets Us, and
Mhm.
they write beautifully about it. They make it very human and natural and easy to relate to. But these scriptures that are connected to us receiving healing, physical healing from sickness and disease. I've heard them appropriated. I do that myself. But I see them now in the emotional wounding as well, that he bore all of that because he gets us and he wants us
Mhm.
to know, I know what it feels like because I love you. And I want
Mhm.
you to know I know what it feels like. I'm there with you, right there in the middle of that horrific pain.
Mhm.
I get you. And so I just want to share that. I don't know if you can relate to that or if you ever thought of it
Yeah.
that way. You think that sounds a little bizarre, but for
No, I
my
think it, I
listeners to
think,
chew on that, I mean, think about that.
yeah, I think in Hebrews it makes it clear that, there's nothing that we're going to experience that he hasn't already experienced, and he can come alongside us with compassion
Yeah,
and understanding.
yeah.
There's no temptation that we've had that he has not faced.
Mhm.
So we have a high priest. It talks about in Hebrews, we have a high priest who can identify with us
Yeah,
in our weaknesses.
yeah. And I stumbled over that for a long time too, because I'm like high priest and all that I get lost in that too if you're
Hmm.
not into all that, the sacraments and things like that, of those kind
Hmm.
of things. So I not to disregard how it says it there, but he is the mediator of the new covenant.
Hmm.
We understand that in arbitration and mediation in the court
Yes.
system, if I'm trying to simplify this for everyday people, that he is the mediator that
Mhm.
understands both sides of the table.
Yes, absolutely.
So your book, let's talk about your book. You have that with you. You hold that up and tell us
Sure, I'd
about
be
your
glad
book.
to. It
What
is.
led you to write it, and tell us about the title.
It is finding my words a ruthless commitment to healing gently after trauma.
Ruthless
And
commitment to
yes,
healing gently after trauma. Beautiful.
and the finding my words came because in the process I found my words, but I didn't have my words. There was a lot of things I couldn't verbalize, and so that was something that came about as a result of going through this process. The play on a ruthless commitment, going through this is, it takes a real commitment that feels ruthless, that you have to do it even though
Hmm.
how hard it is, and but doing it gently, finding people that have gone before you and know how to do it and treat you with love and grace and mercy and respect is so important. And I've had so many people. I've had counselors that have done that. I mentioned Harry Flanagan. He has been and is wonderful in that area of my life. And I've had so many other people that have come alongside. Um, so many people, when I started sharing just a little bit of my story, were like, you should write a book. And I was like, no, I'm not putting that stuff down. And, you know, so I was very hesitant to do that. And then we were at a Bible study with a couple that we had Bible study with many Friday nights. And, they were talking about it. And Eva, her name is, had said to me, why don't you write a book? The story is amazing. Why don't you write a book? And I was like, you know what? Maybe I will. And so that was quite a few years after rehab. And so the chapters 4, 5, and 6 of my childhood that I talk about my childhood in the book, that came from the work that I did with Harry Flanagan, where he had me write down the traumas that had happened in my life and had me explore them. And so it really was the hand of God, I believe. And then, having someone like Josh McDowell write the foreword, somebody who wanted to contribute to the book, but also had been through his own significant trauma, was a real blessing for me. So
Yeah. Yeah, writing a book is something, and when you're writing with stuff like that, and you put it out there, and you're like, they're going to read this.
I know.
I get
I know.
that. I really get that. There's a lot of fear a person has to overcome to put their memoir out there, especially when they dealt with trauma. So what are you doing now? How can people connect with you or reach
I
out
am
to you?
I am doing counseling. That's my real passion.
Mhm.
I'm also doing writing. I've been writing articles and having them published, doing speaking like this, which I love doing. And so it's really great to have the diversification. Spending a lot of time with my wife, Debbie.
Good deal.
Uh, I'm planning on going out to Wyoming. My daughter's in Wyoming.
Oh,
So I'm planning on
wonderful.
spending a couple weeks out there with Emily and Brandon. So life is good. Life
Wow.
is not easy, but it's good.
Yeah, you're right. It's not easy, but it's worth the journey. It's worth the effort.
Yes.
So, is there anything you want our listeners to know before we finish this up?
No, if they want to get in touch with me, they can email me. They can go on my website, www.markmcnear.com, and have the email.
Okay. So, thank you for sharing this today, Mark. Thank you for opening up and being so vulnerable with my listeners today. And thank you for all the work that you've done and that you help others because you're being like Jesus. I'm just seeing this as something I said a few minutes ago. He's a mediator that knows both sides, and you're like that with what you're doing. So, thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you
Thanks
for
for
being
having me
with us.
on. Thanks for inviting me and having me on too.
Oh, my pleasure. This was wonderful. And for our listeners, thank you for being with us today. And get a copy of Mark's book, reach out to him. And thank you for being with me today. And I love you. Mwah. Till next time. Bye bye.